Hi, and welcome back to our next presentation. My name is Jacob Lemke, a healthcare analyst here at ABG. I have the pleasure to welcome our next company, which is Paxman, who develops scalp cooling solutions to reduce hair loss in cancer patients. And with us today, we have their CEO, Richard Paxman. Please go ahead.
Thanks for the introduction, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, even on a Monday. I'm going to be talking to you today about how we are changing the face of cancer across the world. If we can move to the next slide, please. Just to sort of set the scene a little bit, there's about 18 million new cases of cancer every single year, and unfortunately that's only growing. I'm guessing we've probably all been touched by cancer at some point in our lives. So what we're doing really is addressing an unmet need in terms of reducing that difficult side effect of hair loss when a patient has chemotherapy. So as I said, 18 million new cases of cancer every single year, many millions of those have chemotherapy, and unfortunately many millions of those will have hair loss. So we have a huge opportunity to make a big difference to those patients. If we look at the next slide, talking about what hair loss means to a patient. So although from a physician's perspective, this is not always considered the most important thing, let's look at what the patient thinks. So we know that it's one of the most feared side effects in those patients, and about over 75% of the patient population. It's considered the most traumatic, and we think this really because it's so visible, not only to the patient, but to their friends, to their family, to their loved ones. It can lead to social isolation, so patients may consider not going to work and not doing those normal activities like picking up their children from school. It can affect a patient's self-image more than breast surgery. And again, I think that's because it's so visible. And it really prevents those patients wanting that privacy or that normalcy throughout their treatment path. And there's even a patient population who says no to chemotherapy because of hair loss. We're starting to see a massive increase in awareness now around the world about hair loss. And actually, we're now starting to hear people talk about not just retention of the hair, but how fast the hair regrows after the chemotherapy treatment when have scalp cooling. If we go to the next slide, like many exciting businesses, ours has a why behind it. When I was just 10 years old, my mum was diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer. She was in her 30s, she had 4 young children, and she didn't want to be that cancer patient. All those years ago, my mum was actually offered something called scalp cooling, but it didn't work. That was really the first time she was affected by the disease. Affected us as young children and also affected my father. So he started to look at why didn't it work and what can we do to help patients in the future. So as a family, we spent the last 20 years not only developing the technology, improving the technology massively, but also carrying out extensive clinical trials around the world, and then more recently and importantly, improving market access. We lost my mum 20 years ago, but we're very passionate about this, as all of my team are. The next slide just maps out our vision, and it's to make sure that no matter where you are in the world, no matter what type of cancer you have, no matter what your ethnicity or financial situation is or gender, that you have the choice to scalp cooling. And I believe together we can achieve this. If we look at the next slide, just talks a little bit about how it works. It's relatively simple. So we're cooling the scalp to around 18 degrees Celsius. We induce vasoconstriction, therefore reduce the amount of blood flow and therefore chemotherapy to the hair follicles. So reduce drug perfusion. We'll also see a drop in metabolic rate at those lower temperatures, which reduces that cell division, therefore less targeted effect of the chemotherapy. And then more recently in the cell culture models we've developed, we're actually seeing less drug diffuse through the cell membrane, both actively and passively. So this reduction in kinetic energy, and also membrane fluidity. The nice thing about understanding how it works more, those mechanisms, the better we can make it in the future, which is something I'm very excited about. If we look at the next slide, we just look at the equipment that we have. So it's a single model and a double model. These are actually compact refrigeration systems that circulate a liquid coolant and then up through either a reusable cooling cap or a soft single patient use cooling cap. So we actually have the flexibility to offer both models. Of course, our preferred is a single patient use, better for that recurring revenue stream, which we're moving towards, but does give us flexibility, especially because we work in a vast number of markets. Patient wears it for 30 minutes before chemo, during chemo, and for 90 minutes afterwards. Minimal nursing supervision is needed. We have a real good understanding now of how to implement this in different types of cancer centers around the world. If we look at the next slide, this just talks about the clinical data we have. Now, I'm very proud of the clinical data we actually do have. We've got lots of published clinical data, randomized controlled trials, large prospective studies, real-world evidence, as well as a number of open clinical trials as well, always trying to strive for more knowledge and do better at what we do. What we tend to see on average is that about 50 to 60% of our patients are successful with hair retention with our device. But those that aren't successful with hair retention actually have better regrowth, and that's really important, as well as reduced risk of persistent or permanent chemotherapy-induced alopecia. So really strong data for a medical device company. If we look at the next slide, here just looks at our structure. So in 2017, we chose to do an IPO on the First North Nasdaq small cap market, an absolutely brilliant moment for our company. So we have a strong Swedish board and UK board really driving that business forward. The choice to do the IPO was really about investing into our US market and launching that business. So we have Paxman Group Limited, which is a holding company. We have Paxman Coolers Limited, which was really the heart of the business in terms of our manufacturing, our research and development, our regulatory, our marketing, our finance. And then we have Paxman US Inc., which is our latest company, but actually now takes up 50% of the company's revenue and our key growth area. If we look at the next slide, we just talk a little bit about our people, something I've invested heavily in since the IPO in 2017. So we're now at just under 75 people, really strong regulatory team, really strong in overseas and international activity, research and development team, and our US team. But overall, very impressive, and a strong leadership group as well, which I'm proud of. We really have a diverse and inclusive approach to what we do, and everyone is incredibly passionate about growing this business and actually making a real difference. If we look at our next slide, this just talks about where we are today. So we've installed about 4,500 of these machines around the world now, which is pretty impressive, in about 60 markets internationally, but we've got so much more to do. What I like to look at is the UK business to really show what we can do around the world. We've over 1,000 systems installed in the UK in 99% of the National Health Service. If we can do what we've done in the UK and the rest of the world, we have an incredibly exciting business. Looking at the next slide, just talks about the different business models we use. So we've historically used traditional distributors, relatively low cost and low risk entry into a market. It's worked very well for us. It's helped grow our business, selling capital equipment. But we really need to start adapting and changing those business models. We've started pushing on recurring revenues, which are over 50% of our business now, which is really the exciting bit. Japan is a distributor, but we get not only capital equipment sales, but we get a per patient sale via the cooling cap itself. Mexico, we have a licensing deal with Teva, where we get a per treatment revenue. The US I'll talk about, but that's all recurring revenues. And then Canada, a new market for us, also looking at recurring revenues. So we've got flexibility, which I think is important for growth. If we look at the next slide, this just talks about our US entry. We've invested heavily into this market. It's the largest market in the world for healthcare, in fact, for many businesses. Where we are today, we've got 950 scalp coolers in over 400 locations, and we've treated about 9,000 patients by the end of the year. We are scratching at the surface. The market, total addressable market, is huge. So what we actually do is we install equipment free of charge or on a low lease cost across different places where they are interested in scalp cooling. So the largest academic centers like MD Anderson, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dana-Farber, you name it, and also community oncology sites. We work very closely with US Oncology, the largest community oncology provider in the United States. So that install of base of equipment. And then what happens in our current self-pay model is that the patient is provided prescribed scalp cooling by the provider. What happens then is we call the patient, we take payment from the patient, and then we dispatch from our specialty pharmacy a single patient use cooling cap that goes directly to the patient. They then bring their cooling cap on their first day of treatment. So we derive income from the cooling cap and a number of treatments. It's worked very well to date, but it is limited, and actually reimbursement is an important process that we're looking at going forward. And I'll talk more about that shortly. If we look at the next slide, this just looks at our revenue. So we had this nice 300% growth curve to begin with early on in our 2017 to 2019. Of course, COVID impacted us, but very much in our distributor markets where others pivoted, we still managed to see some growth in our direct markets and 10% growth in the US. Back to 2021, we're now seeing this nice growth trajectory with strong growth by the end of the year, especially in Q4, as you can see that they're really impressive. We had a strong order book at the end of the year. Just got to be mindful that we have had some supply chain issues. So we've got to be realistic about what we can achieve going forward. But we're very excited about the remainder of 2022. If we look at the next slide, we just talk about that revenue split. So 78 million up to 96 million from 2020 to 2022. But look at where the main of the revenues are coming from now. Actually, United States with over 51% of that income. And we're working in 65 markets globally. Looking at our next slide, focusing on the US. Now, it's not all our eggs in one basket scenario. We do look at our overseas growth, but the US, as I said, has to be key. From 2020 to 2021, that 42% growth. So very excited about pushing that boundary even more. But what we really need to do is focus on reimbursement for that key growth going forward. Looking at our next slide, this is just another key performance indicator, that average daily treatment revenue. Look at it bumping up from Q3 to Q4. And we really want to see that consistent growth throughout the remainder of 2022 and beyond. But I think you'll start to see the big steps when reimbursement really kicks in. Looking at our next slide, this just talks about the investment we've made in the US. A scalp cooler itself costs around 83,000 SEK. There are about 6 patients to break even, so not a large amount. We've installed about 56 million SEK worth of equipment to date, and that's given us a return of about 258%, so 143 million SEK. As I said though, still scratching at the surface, and much of that equipment's underutilized, so our driving force is to push that utilization up to really help with that profitability. If we look at our next slide, this just talks about the funding we've had over the years. So we did the IPO in 2017, raising 30 million SEK. We then took on some debt as we were expanding into the United States. And then based on some really strong institutional investor interest early on in 2021, and then some brilliant news from the public payer in America at the end of 2021, we raised a further amount of funding via a direct issue to really start focusing on the growth of this business. And I'll talk about those different investments shortly. So we now have got to the end of 2021 with very limited debt in the company and no debt in the top company, but a really strong cash balance was at 70 million SEK to drive the business forward. Looking at our next slide, this just gives you a bit of an idea about our growth. So you see nice consistent revenue growth from 2020 to 2021. And we do expect that trend to continue throughout 2022, of course. But as I mentioned before, we had some supply chain issues early in the year for obvious reasons. I think we've all seen it. We, of course, will start to see an increase in our cost structure as well from 2020 to 2021 based on the world opening up and not getting government support anymore. But then 2022, of course, we've done those 2 directed issues to invest in the business and really invest in growth. So aiming for positive EBITDA, of course, but it may be bumpy along the way. If we look at our next slide, this just highlights our worldwide potential. So US market alone could be a 600 million total addressable market, US dollars. But then look at the rest of the world as well, 80 million new cases of cancer every single year. So based on that potential opportunity, and we look at the next slide, we carried out 2 directed issues, as I said before, raising 59 million SEK in the first, and then a further 77 million SEK in the second, really allowing us to focus on reimbursement, research and development, reducing our debt, of course, and that internationalization of our business. We look at the next slide. Here just talks about where our investments are. So very much about focusing on putting that Paxman brand in many key markets. So we're looking at working directly in Scandinavia now. We've got a presence in India now, Germany and France, where we've both got presence and also people. And then Canada, we're in a pilot process at the moment, really to crack that market, and it's been a difficult one over the years. And then, of course, we continue to invest heavily into the United States. More recently, we've just signed a letter of interest in China, and I'm working now on finalizing that agreement so we can start looking at building a stronger presence in Asia. If we look at our next slide, this just talks about the reimbursement that we've been doing, work that we've been doing. Paxman have really led the way in these discussions, working with NCCN to get scalp cooling on the guidelines. We've of course got FDA clearance. We've been working with the American Medical Association looking at coding. So coding has to be specific to scalp cooling, and that didn't exist before. And then more recently, actually working with our competitor Dignitana on a process through Medicare, Medicaid, which is the public payer. The news came out at the end of last year, reassigning a payment amount for scalp cooling at about $1,850. This is a huge breakthrough for patients and ultimately the company. And it's a strong signal to say that scalp cooling will be universally reimbursed in the future. So based on that, we've been working on a new business model, which allows the providers to bill the payer, which is not something that's possible as of today. So if we look at the next slide, this just talks about how we're changing. So I touched on our self-pay business model earlier. What we're going to start doing is using McKesson, which is one of the largest distributors in the world for healthcare. In fact, one of the largest healthcare companies in the world. And we will sell our cooling caps, our single patient cooling caps, to McKesson Specialty Distribution. They in turn will sell them to our customers, who will then stock those cooling caps on their shelves, waiting for patients to be enrolled in the scalp cooling program. So a very simple buy and bill model, but we've really set up a strong infrastructure around this. If you go to the next slide, this just talks about how the patient will then now interact. So your patient will go through an enrollment process, prescribe scalp cooling. We will then intake that enrollment form, and we will set up the infrastructure to carry out benefits investigations, prior authorizations, appeals, and also set up a really robust patient assistance program, something which is close to my heart, making sure this is equitable as possible, but reducing the risk from the patient's perspective, and also the provider's perspective. So a really robust model. We launched in May, and we've got our first patients going through this as we speak. So early days, but an exciting opportunity for the business and ultimately for the patients getting access to this treatment. If we go to the next slide, this just talks about our research and development, something I'm passionate about, something that we've got to do better in the future. We have to make this work for all patients, not just 50 to 60% of them. So we have a product which is topical in development, which will be used in conjunction with scalp cooling. The results in vitro look very promising. We're now developing nano formulation to get that delivered to the scalp. This not only adds efficacy, but also gives us opportunity for consumable products in the future. And then our research and development to the cooling cap, so a perfect fitting cooling cap, but also something mass producible, or even more so than our current cap, but also good for the environment, something sustainable. So again, giving us more opportunity to enter into more recurring revenue streams in the future, but providing better efficacy as well. If we look at the next slide, this just talks about our potential for a new clinical unmet need. This is peripheral neuropathy, if I could say it. This affects so many millions of patients around the world, and it can seriously be debilitating. In fact, just going on behind me now, I've got a meeting with our Singapore team, ongoing, looking at our research and development. So as of today, we have alpha prototypes for this cryo compression device in clinical trial in Singapore. And we're just in the process of planning a large clinical trial in the United States to once and for all prove that cryo compression can really benefit a patient in preventing this clinical unmet need. If we go to the next slide, it just looks at what the device is going to look like. We have a really strong team working on this development. I'm very excited about this. This could potentially have more impact than scalp cooling, based on the fact that the only way to treat this at the moment in reality is reducing the patient's chemotherapy, which is something that we don't always, of course, want to do. And it has a high cost to the healthcare system. So please watch this space, and hopefully you'll see more information on this over the next few months. If we go to the next slide, I just want to finish off talking about our Scalp Cooling Summit. We've just done this in May, and I was absolutely amazed. And it really highlights the strong relationships we have across the globe. If we look at the next slide, we had 49 speakers at our virtual event from a large number of countries, 10 countries in fact, with over 1,300 delegates from around the world. Incredibly proud of this achievement. And I think it's really setting the standard and really setting us apart from many other healthcare companies in terms of being able to pull this off. So very proud of my team and looking forward to seeing the results of this over the coming 6 to 12 months. So if we go to the next slide, I think that's me done for the day, but I really do believe together we can make a difference. This is not only a good commercial decision in terms of investment, but it really has a magnificent social impact also. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. My first question is on the US market and the new reimbursement. As you said, I mean, it increases the coverage to 1,850 per patient from essentially zero before, I believe. I mean, please tell us a bit more about what this means for you and when you expect to benefit from this shift.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, currently there's very limited reimbursement. Patients are going through to their own insurance companies and being successful with reimbursement, but this is a very long process and unfair on the patient. So this new 1,850 for one of the codes makes a big difference. Bearing in mind our current income per patient is on average $1,400. The biggest thing we have to do now is switch our existing 400 strong customer base to a new buy and bill model, which is something we're leading the way in and something we're in the process of. We've just signed up our first 8 locations and have a large number of other contract negotiations. As we switch our current customer base to this new model, that allows them to then start billing the payers. So whether that's Medicare, Medicaid, or the commercial payers. So last week alone, we've had our first patients enroll through the program. I'm not clear on exactly the outcomes as yet, but ultimately, if we start getting positive coverage decisions for these patients, that's going to provide an impetus for new sites to start coming on board even quicker and ultimately getting patients paid for, which is what we want. We want patient access, but longer term, that means impressive growth revenues for the company.
Okay, and I mean, as you mentioned during the presentation, I think you have around 900 installed systems in the US. Tell us a bit about sort of the usage of those currently and what potential you see from growing from your already sort of installed clinics, but also the potential for new clinics.
Yeah, okay. So the reality is that equipment that we've currently got installed is underutilized. So if you think, let's say a system could be used by 1 or 2 patients per day every single day. So if you do the rough numbers, you'll know that our systems are not fully utilized every single day. In fact, we are scratching at the surface. So what we have to do is really focus on improving utilization, which is something we're doing. But also we know the biggest barrier to that utilization is reimbursement. And that's where much of our focus, in fact, $1.4 million worth of focus has been, pounds worth, sorry. Longer term, I think when we start to work with new cancer centers and we've got the feedback from the reimbursement model, I believe that our utilization numbers are going to be far greater as they will start without the barrier. But there's lots of interest also as well in the US. We're seeing new sites every single week open up, which is wonderful, even on the self-pay model.
Okay, and I mean, also on the numbers, I mean, when I look at it, it seems like overall you have only taken like a couple of % of the breast cancer market. So where do you see the potential for the penetration rate to go in the sort of mid to long term?
It's a good question. I have to be careful. too many forward-looking statements, but I think, realistically, 10% with the starts of reimbursement is relatively easy to achieve. But I'd like to see that 25% and above, which I think can be easily achieved as well, based on even the customer base that we're working with already, and really improving that utilization. It's not a hard thing to achieve, I think, if this is paid for and becomes standard of care, and that's where we've really got to get it to, standard of care.
Yeah, and what can you do on your side to help drive this increased adoption?
Continued working on this on our reimbursement piece. So it's about working with local MACs who manage the Medicare situation. We've got to have better relationships with the commercial payers. Although the relationship, we have to remember, is not between Paxman and the payer, it's between the payer and the provider. So those are key things that we're working on in 2022 and have been previously working on, and that's what's going to make the difference. As well as continued relationships with our provider network. Ultimately, they are the ones who are prescribing this technology. So heightened awareness and adoption of that technology, but further reimbursement will be key.
Okay, and finally, just on your new product for, I think it's called Cryo Compression, just tell us a bit about the path forward there.
Okay, so we will continue to carry out clinical trials in the US, in Singapore with our alpha prototypes. And that's really driving the development here in the UK in terms of what we need to achieve for a trial-ready device, which we're just about there. We're just making some improvements and tweaks. We will then start manufacturing our trial devices for the United States. We're looking to start manufacturing those later this year, up to 200 machines to go into clinical trial. And at the same time, we're working on a clinical trial plan for the United States of America, with an aim to do about 400 patients over about 25 to 30 locations. Once we've completed that clinical trial, which of course will take some time, we will look to commercialize in the US. During that period, we may look to enter markets which will allow us to, without that definitive data set. But the reality is we must prove that this is safe and efficacious in a good randomized clinical trial. And that is our main focus at this moment in time.
Okay, understood. I think in the interest of time, we'll stop here. But thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much, and good to see you again, or speak to you again, should I say.
And we'll now take a 30-minute lunch break before being back at 12:30.